Well, greetings, everyone, and welcome to today's editorial webcast, 5 Best Practices for Enforcing Password Policies. This event is sponsored by SpecOps and presented by Redmond magazine. My name is Leif Lowe, and I'll be your moderator for today's webcast. Thank you all again for joining us. Well, passwords are certainly still one of the primary ways of controlling access to your devices and applications. And while the password is indeed a time-tested key to any digital gateway, there are certainly right ways and wrong ways to apply them. Establishing and enforcing strong password policies is critical for organizations to truly protect and limit the access to your digital assets and devices. Passwords and the users who apply their own passwords are often the weakest link in any security infrastructure. Any from using simple, easily cracked passwords to the classic step of writing them down on a sticky note and sticking it on their computer. Getting your users to adhere to stronger password policies will go a long way toward protecting your organization. But during today's webcast, we'll be discussing best practices for ensuring that your passwords are indeed protecting your organization's digital assets, and some steps you can take to make your password policies as effective as possible. You should come away from today's webcast with some actionable tactics you can put into place right away to improve your password strength. Now, before we begin, I just have a few housekeeping items to run through. If you would like to submit a question at any time, which we strongly encourage you to do, just look for the question field down to the left of the slide window there in your console view. Type your question in there and hit submit, and we will get to as many of those as we can at the end of the presentations. Also want to let you know we are recording this webcast, and it will be archived for future viewing, so you can review it again or pass it along to share with a colleague. And starting tomorrow, you can access the rebroadcast using the same link you used today. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers for today's webcast. Later in the presentation, we'll be hearing from Liz Rivera. She is the Product Marketing Manager for SpecOps Software. Liz has been working in the software industry delivering market-oriented solutions to IT professionals for the past 14 years. Well, our featured speaker today is Nick Cavalancia. Nick has more than 25 years of enterprise IT experience. He is an accomplished consultant, speaker, trainer, writer, and columnist. He's earned the MCSE, MCT, Master CNE, Master CNI, and Microsoft MVP certifications. Quite a bit there. He has authored, co-authored, and contributed to nearly 24 books on various technology topics. He regularly speaks, writes, and blogs for some of the most recognized tech companies. And if you'd like, you can follow him in either of those Twitter handles listed there on his bio slide. Well, thanks again for joining us today, Nick. Appreciate that. And today,
it's an honor as always, Leif. Thanks for having me.
Indeed. And today, Nick and I will be discussing some of the factors around passwords and establishing and maintaining an effective password policy. Thank you all again for joining us today. And now, Nick, let's begin our exploration of some of the most troubling concerns around passwords. Well, first of all, to start off, what should every password include? I mean, are there the special characters, numbers, the length of the password, that sort of thing? I mean, if someone's setting up their own password, what steps can they take to ensure that's sufficiently strong?
That's a great question. There's actually a couple of factors I think I'll kind of spell out, and then some of this is kind of basic blocking and tackling for you guys in the audience. Some of this stuff might be things you already know, but let's just kind of walk through here and level set so everyone's on the same base here. The first one is length. That's actually probably one of the best factors you can have. If you were to have, everyone always thinks about complexity more than length. But if you were to have a password, I was reading an article the other day that said if you took, I think it was 12 regularly formed English words that were unrelated, so you're saying like backyard, wagon, hashtag, it'd be a bunch of words, put them together, and depending on the length, they were coming up with the number of possible combinations. And it was a huge, long number with a bunch of commas, and then the unit of measure was, I'm going to try and get this right, a quadrantillion, which is 10 to the 124th power. And I hadn't heard of a quadrantillion. That sounded like it was a bazillion. It just sounded like a made-up word. But anyway, so very, very long, and the amount of time that it would take with the current computing power we have today to crack that kind of password, basically the sun would burn out before the password would get cracked. So length is always a good one. However, we all know no user is going to type in like an 84-character password, let alone memorize one. So, so we have to forego length in a lot of cases, and we go with complexity. And that, of course, you already mentioned a little bit there, Leif, things like special characters, using numbers and letters, upper, lower case, just simply because we were trying to simply increase the possible number of outcomes. And that way, think of just something simple as a 3-character password. And if I have 26 characters, let's say just lowercase letters, it's 26 to the third power is the number of possible combinations. We want to increase that so length helps. And then adding in upper and lower case, adding in numbers, adding in the special characters and so on helps to increase the complexity there and the length of time it would take to crack that password. There also needs to be probably, and for a sufficiently strong password, is a lack of what I'll call association. So ties to common or known words, like places, phrases, that kind of thing, so that there's not something where people are always putting like my mom always uses like her first grandchild's name, that kind of thing. That's bad. Don't do that either. And as we all know, cardinal rule number 1, do not use the word password for password.
Right.
And then the last one here that kind of comes into for a sufficiently strong password, it's a little bit of a different angle here, but is just the idea of rotating the password, changing it frequently, that sort of thing. So those 4 things I think together are what are going to help make a password very strong and sort of as the basis for like a password policy moving forward.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good foundations to think of. It sounds like the length. I hadn't. I guess I hadn't given that sufficient thought. Maybe next time I have to put in a password, I'll be like, "We the people, in order to form a more perfect union," or something like that.
I actually have a password. In some cases, I use an actual English sentence, properly written, commas, and you make sure that the way you're writing it has some apostrophes, a pound sign, and an exclamation point, whatever it is. And then that way it's really long. It's got spaces. I mean, that's something that obviously you can easily remember, but you have to know your grammar, I think, if you're going to start using, commas and semicolons or whatever. But anyways, you were saying.
Right. Easier to make a misstep when you're typing it in, for sure.
Right.
All right. Now, from the IT administrator's point of view, what sort of policies should an organization have in place to govern their password structure? I mean, what sort of rules and regulations should they set up? They're really built around those 4 pillars?
I'm glad we're talking about. Well, yes and no. I'm glad we're talking about policies first off because you guys in the audience, we all know a user would just type the word password if they could, or their dog's name, or just something really simple. If you guys go back as far as I do, you remember was it Ferris Bueller's Day Off, and he just looks on the desk and sees the password written there on a Post-it kind of a thing. And it's just a word. I remember my very first admin password. It was a Novell 311 environment. If you guys go that far back, we also had a 2.2 NetWare server in non-dedicated mode for those who really go far back. And the password for the supervisor account, the admin account, was just the word serious. That's it. And so policies need to be put in place because people always tend to go back to something they're very comfortable with. And so a couple things come to mind: eliminating common passphrases. So things like password, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I'll go against 0. Just the common things; those should be wiped out. Another set of policies should be around. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and another one would be eliminating or putting in place kind of a single user, single password. That's probably more about accounts than it is passwords, but I think it needs to be kind of said. So the use of shared accounts is less secure than having individual accounts. And for those of you that are really trying to get to a very secure environment where users have, it's sort of like a least privilege type environment, maybe even taking it a step further where you're even getting to closer to like a zero trust type of environment, something like that, then you're really making sure that even individual users have, let's say, low level and an elevated level credentials that are separate. And even those would have separate policies put on each of those kind of things. So there's definitely some guidelines around that. And then probably no use of common substitutions, things like using an A for the @ sign for the A, excuse me. So like if the word install was going to be one of the words as the base root of your password, it's, capital INST @LL kind of a thing. You're eliminating that so that you just can't do that either. It's just to make sure that users have to do something that's really, we're all trying to push them to do something cryptic. We want it to be 3 tilde hashtag lowercase b 97. I mean, we want it to be really just nonsensical if we could, but how do you remember that? And that becomes the tough thing.
Right. Yeah. How do you remember it and without writing it down? That's the killer.
Kind of, yes.
Yeah. All right. Now, once these policies are put in place, how should an organization go about enforcing them? What are some of the fundamental best practices for making sure the people actually adhere to these password policies?
Well, the first one is, and this is sort of, there's no way to get around this. You got to rely on some kind of tool, be it the native tools that Microsoft provides inside group policies, or using a third-party solution or something like that. But you're trying to look at something that is going to do the enforcement for you. Right. But then also, I think, kind of rolling back the question a little bit, we talk about best practices. When enforcing, I'm going to kind of change the question a little bit, when enforcing password policies. Things like I just talked about elevated and non-elevated accounts, probably having different password policies for each.
Oh, okay.
So the one that's elevated might be a little longer, a little more complex, have a little more requirement to it, potentially require that to be changed more frequently. Something along those lines. So definitely having granular policies based on what I'll call the risk factor of a given role or an individual within the organization. That kind of comes into play there. Then there are the idea of trying to enforce things like the complexity and length of password. This just becomes part of some kind of, whether again it's in group policies or something third party, just looking at the natural kinds of factors that you can mandate there. And then the other thing is, in terms of enforcing password policies, would probably be if there's a hybrid environment where some on-prem, some in the cloud, is probably the use of some kind of single sign-on solution. Maybe even incorporating some two-factor or multi-factor authentication in there as well, just to try and simplify the idea of, and I'm going back to the thought of, you guys in the audience want to enforce a password policy, and let's say one of the policies is you can't use a password used previously. Okay, so the user changes their password in Active Directory to, I'll call it password 2. Just go with it for the moment. We know that's not a secure password, but you get where I'm going. Used to be password 1, and they never used password 1, so they want to use password 1 up on the cloud, but then it's a different password, and you're trying to get, which one am I remembering now? Which one is for which? So we just go, let's just single sign on. It's a lot easier, but then, of course, the thing that gets me worried as a security professional is the thing I don't like about SSO, even though I love SSO, the thing I don't like about it is once you have the keys to the kingdom, you have the keys to the kingdom. You log in once and you have access to everything. So, if you're going to do that, it certainly makes it easier for the user, but then I think the handoff has to be, if we're going to do that for the user, then I'm going to require a bit more secure of a password policy. It might change the passwords more frequently, require more complex passwords, require it to be a little longer, things like that. So that way, that trade-off is still balanced a little bit with an elevated sense of security around it.
Yep. All right, that makes sense. All right. Well, another kind of modern reality these days is that everyone has multiple devices. They might have a desktop, a laptop, a phone, a tablet. What are some of the best ways organizations can handle all these multiple passwords when dealing with multiple devices? I mean, you mentioned single sign-on and the risks around that, but...
And that may come into play here as well. I think the first thing that comes to mind for me when I'm thinking about an organization where there are multiple devices, let's say per user, let's just kind of clarify that.
Yeah, per user, that's what I was thinking of. Yeah.
I would think you have to start with the risk that exists and try to identify what risk exists. For example, if all the devices are connecting on your internal network, that's one level of risk versus if, let's say, the mobile device is connecting to your mobile network, connecting to your network from outside. Because, say, for the sake of argument, let's take someone's got an Android device and they're connecting to Office 365. Right, that's completely outside the quote unquote, the borders of the perimeter of the corporate network because it's outside completely. And there's a lot of Android-based mobile malware that's going out there in an effort to try and get people's credentials and that sort of thing. So see, there's an elevated level of risk there. And so I just kind of figured that out. There might even need to be multiple accounts. I use the example of the lower level and versus the elevated versus non-elevated type of accounts, if you will. Yeah. But I know most organizations, no one's going to go and create, for example, a Sally account for when Sally's inside the network and a Sally account for when she's outside the network. That makes no sense. Yeah. You could do that anyways. But my point is you're going to have to look and see things like if, let's say, someone's using a mobile device and they're accessing outside the network, you may decide, I think I want to put some kind of EMM solution, an enterprise mobility management solution in and containerize the whole access to, let's say, corporate email, as the case might be. Now, we're getting kind of off topic from passwords, but the idea is that's the first thing, is just trying to figure out the risk that's involved and figure out what you're going to do there. I think multi-factor authentication definitely comes into play, especially when you're looking at multiple devices, because the device itself should act as a form of authentication because that is something you have. You have the right device. That's true. And then you have the password. That's something you know. So we are kind of in a multi-factor authentication type of situation. But most of you in the audience, probably without some kind of solution that's paying attention to what device it is and then double checking that, you're not really thinking of the device as a factor. And so having some kind of multi-factor authentication could be an option to come into play there as well. And then the last one here, when it comes to, since there's multiple devices, and again, I'm thinking that there's varying levels of risk with each device, especially for elevated accounts. And elevated accounts isn't just like domain admins or an OU admin or anything like that. It could be any kind of account that has access to something that would be considered sensitive, critical, protected, or just plain old valuable outside the organization in the black market kind of a thing. Might look at something like privileged account management, which is a little bit more advanced of a topic than what we're talking about today, but it still revolves around protecting passwords of privileged accounts. So that might be something else to look at.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I like the way you're framing it. It's sort of like almost a de facto multi-factor authentication, because the network should recognize the device with which they're logging in, and you just have to make sure it's the right person using it.
Again, if the solution in play or a solution in play does even pay attention to that, because like, for example, Windows, obviously you have to belong to the domain to log into the domain. Got that. But what I mean is from a standpoint of, it's almost when you're going back to like sort of a zero trust type model where I don't even trust the account. So I need to go, well, are you on a trusted device? Oh, I am on a trusted device. Okay, then checkbox, a little less risk because you're on a trusted device, that kind of thing. So it's a little out of band, but at the same time, it still comes into play.
Yeah, part of the puzzle. All right. Now, what are some of the, we've talked about some of the things that some people do. What are some of the most common mistakes you see in organizations with how they manage their passwords or what some users do?
Okay, so
talk about this for a while.
No, you really can. So I've got a couple of notes here. So I think there's a couple of simple things. It's probably the lack of what I'll call a federated view of passwords and password policy. So I'm thinking of it from a standpoint of you guys in the audience have a hybrid environment of some kind. You have multiple directories coming into play. And I don't just mean AD and then Azure AD / Office 365. I mean you have that and you're using Salesforce, which technically has its own directory, and using some other, some Oracle-based product, and it's got its own directory. And so you've got all these directories, and there's sort of a lack of, and again, I'm calling it a federated view, my own term, just meaning that you can see all of the passwords that are being there. And then all of the policies that apply to make sure that at least the same policies or something equivalent is being pushed down in each case. Then the other one is probably not addressing the issue of credential misuse. If you guys ever read the Verizon Data Breach Investigations report, you should. It comes out about March or April of every year. The Verizon Enterprise, their security group, actually gets usually 50, 60, 70,000 incidents, and then comes up with a very statistically relevant set of data around what do data breaches look like, and one of the things that always comes in is how credential misuse, both by insiders and external attackers, where they're leveraging those accounts improperly to access data. So it could be somebody who is using their own account, logging at the wrong time, totally different issue than what we're talking about today. But it could be someone who's using that person's credentials, and I think we have a question coming up about people sharing credentials, and I'll talk about that problem because that's actually very real. And then, of course, some external hacker leveraging a compromised account where they were either tricked somebody out of doing it or tricked them into installing some software where they could monitor what their keystrokes and that kind of thing. So those things kind of come into play. And you don't think about that problem and then using policy as sort of one means to the security end of trying to stop it. Things like make sure that passwords are sufficiently complex, making sure that they change enough, maybe again going back to the idea of using privileged account management maybe to lock down further the access to very privileged passwords, as it were. That kind of thing comes into play. And then I think the last thing is not assessing the risk based on a role, and I mentioned that a little bit on, where you're looking at someone who has access to, let's say, the entire customer database, or all of our credit card data, or all of our patient health information, or whatever it is, and anything. It could even be your supplier list. It doesn't matter, but they have access to something, and you go, all right, that account has access to some pretty sensitive stuff. I think I want to put a more stringent password policy on that account to make sure that it's definitely that person getting in. Someone isn't, just trying to look over their shoulder and guess what their password is, whatever it is, that kind of thing. Just trying to make sure that the account itself is sufficiently secure. Yeah.
All right. Some good guidelines for sure. Yeah, and again, that segues. You mentioned something. Part of the next question here. I mean, some people are just going to be stubborn, or maybe they're lazy, or who knows what. But how do you deal with those employees that just won't follow the basic protocols for whatever reason? Like the people that insist on writing down their passwords or sharing the passwords with their coworker or whatnot.
Okay, so the writing down is a tough one, right? We can't stop people from writing their password. You can with, like HR policy, saying if we find that you did it, we're going to, dock your pay or fire you or whatever it is, right? Sternly talk to you more than once, whatever they're going to do. But from a technology standpoint, can't really address that, but things like sharing passwords, let's talk about that for a second. So if I was to ask you guys in the audience, if you were here in front of me, I'd say, hey, by a show of hands, how many of you think, and I'm actually putting my hand up here in my office as if you're in front of me, how many of you actually think that your users share their passwords? And probably some of you are going, oh, I absolutely know what happens, but there's a really good portion of you that are probably going, nah, they don't do that. And there was an insider threat persona study done in 2017, late 2017, so not a little less than a year ago, a company called IS Decisions out of France. And they found that 49% of employees shared their credentials. And these were from departments like legal, HR, IT, finance. Right? These are not just like, the accounting clerk or, or the mailroom, admin or I don't know, something. These are like really serious departments. And then at the same time, what was actually also in that report is that 52% of the employees that did it, so half the people that did I guess it's technically like a quarter, it's half of the half, they saw, and get this, they saw no risk to their employer in doing so. They're like, I can give Susie my credentials. It's fine. It's not going to cause any risk. They're clearly not aware at all. So it's a very real possibility, probability, maybe already exists for some of you, just sort of depends. So there are repercussions there, particularly when you think of things like insider threats. That's easy. I used somebody else's password. There, I got in and I get access to whatever they have access to and stole some data, and you think that they did it, not me. Yay! I can't get in trouble for that. So the things there that if you're trying to have people not follow basic protocol, going back to your question, certainly HR policies. Things like an acceptable use policy. This is very early on. This is when they first join the organization. Here's our acceptable use policy. You may not share passwords, blah, blah, blah. That kind of thing can go in there. Certainly for you guys today, doing things like auditing logons is very possible. You can do it right out of the box with Microsoft. You probably have to do a little bit of some kind of log consolidation to make sure you're getting logons to local logons for machines and that sort of thing. But it is feasible. Use a SIEM solution, something like that, consolidate all the logon data there, and look for unusual logon activity. Which applies to both insider threats, like my example of me logging on with, let's say, Sally's account, and I'm logged on from my machine, and Sally always logs on from her machine. That's unusual, so that's a problem. And also the same thing with compromised accounts. One of the things that external attackers will do in a lot of ways will try and do lateral movement. They get a foothold into one machine. They try to leverage some kind of elevated credentials on that machine to get a foothold. And once they have a foothold, they try to move laterally using SMB connections, RDP sessions, whatever they can possibly do to get to other machines and jump around and hop from machine to machine, continue the process over and over again until they finally get access to the data or the application or whatever it is that they want. And sometimes that actually, by the way, includes things like Active Directory. So you might be looking for the logon of accounts, even the accounts that are very elevated accounts in Active Directory. There was a data breach. I'm trying to remember who the company was, and I can't remember what the company did is they actually broke into a supplier of the actual target company they wanted to hit, and they got the supplier company, and they hacked in so well that they created multiple accounts in Active Directory, created email addresses, and then pretended that those email addresses were real people and sent information over to company B, their actual target, to get them to like send them money as a supplier or something. So I mean, it's a long-tailed strategy, but it's really nasty. The idea of logons and passwords really does kind of come into play here.
Yeah, and for someone trying to mitigate that situation, that's a lot of layers to have to dig through.
Yeah, agree.
That's wild. All right. Well, looking ahead here, what do you see in the future? What do you think the future in the future for passwords, and what do you see coming next for password management and policy and that sort of thing?
I see a lot more use of multi-factor authentication for even the most common of users. So seeing it more widespreadly used. I mean, we're seeing it with Google. Google already has it. You can get that yourself today if you want. Yeah. Although I've seen Kevin Mitnick hack it. That was kind of interesting. You can find that on the web. Watch Kevin Mitnick hack Google two-factor authentication, and it's fairly interesting to watch. But still, having multi-factor authentication comes into play, and the multi-factors isn't just like getting a text. It could be leveraging, utilizing some other identities that you have that are trusted identities. So you're trying to log on to, I'm sort of making this up as I go along, but I know that it exists today. I know even like SpecOps has something like this. You log into, let's say, Active Directory, and you want to validate yourself. Well, you can have an email sent over to your Gmail account. And then because you can access that verifies that you are who you say you are kind of thing. So again, you're kind of back down to that. Still, that's something you know and something you have. I know my password, but then I have access to my Gmail account or my Facebook account or my LinkedIn or whatever the case is. So there's lots of ways of doing multi-factor authentication there. Certainly more awareness training. Yeah. The multi-factor and the two-factor authentication have been broken before. I myself got vished this week. If you guys don't know what vishing is, it's voice phishing. It's where they use the phone to try and fool you. So I got vished this week, and if you look up I got vished and my name, you'll find the blog somewhere. Just put it out this week. And basically the crux of it is they were trying to get access to my PayPal account, and I kind of fell for it because just they caught me at the right moment. And they were calling me, and I was their two-factor authentication. They literally fooled me into giving them the two-factor authentication code until I went, wait a second, you bastard. Got me, because it just never happened. I was super thrilled. But anyways, so more security awareness training so that you're aware of these things happening, which is one of the reasons that I didn't go all the way through and just let them fool me. I actually shut them down, which was good. And then probably an increased focus on utilizing privileged account management, which again, at its core, is about trying to take passwords and lock them away and make sure only certain people can gain access to those passwords, rotating them constantly, even doing things like rotating them after every use. That sort of thing kind of ties in here. So I think those are probably the things that I think are most coming down the pipe to try and the awareness training is going to help users understand why you need to have a password. Here's a security culture. Here's why you need to do that. That's what we're asking. A lot of times users don't want to do it because they don't get it. And if you get them to buy into it, then they do it. So that's where I think the awareness training comes into play. The MFA is just to help augment the passwords you already have, and then the increased focus on something like privileged access management, privileged account management, is more for just those passwords that need to be like uber secure. So I think that'll help.
Okay. Yeah, it's kind of a combination of policy and technology, and certainly training, as you said. Like making people realize what's at stake. I mean, thinking back to what you were talking about, the people from legal departments and HR departments sharing passwords, like being oblivious about it.
Scary stuff.
Yeah. Yep. Well, thank you very much, Nick. Those are some great insights, some great things to think about for sure. All right, well, moving right along. Now I would like to introduce our next speaker, Liz Rivera from SpecOps. Take it away, Liz.
Thanks, Leif, and interesting discussion, guys. So before I dive in, I just want to say a word about SpecOps software. So SpecOps has been developing simple Active Directory integrated solutions that really focus on solving complex IT problems, and we've been doing this for the past 17 years. Here at SpecOps, we offer two main product portfolios that focus on security and efficiency. Our authentication and password management portfolio addresses everything from meeting audit requirements to reducing help desk password reset calls to most recently, now we're securing the Office 365 login with multi-factor authentication. And our desktop management portfolio really looks at maximizing efficiency by automating application and OS deployments to users' machines. So with over 5,000 customers across 50 countries, many of which happen to be password management customers, we really have firsthand insight into what organizations are really doing today with passwords. So in the recent years, there's been an influx of password-related security breaches that really has shined a spotlight on the reality that passwords are just inherently weak. And this is predominantly due to, as Nick was saying and Leif, the reliance on us mere mortals creating them. And if you think about it, most users are not really security aware or conscious. And, all of us do have many passwords to recall or contend with, not just, for business purposes, but for personal purposes. And all of these factors really lead to us kind of relying on some unsecure behavior, such as, circumventing the rules during password change, meaning that, when you're changing the password, you're not really changing the password, but you're just adding, numbers or symbols at the end or the beginning, or substituting characters. And of course, reusing passwords is a common thing that we do as well. And if you look at all of these things, hackers obviously take advantage of this behavior. There isn't a lack of password-related attacks that take advantage of all of this. And on the other hand, there has been a lot of hype in recent years. There's a lot of shakeup of traditional password best practices, password complexity and expiry, which are still required by the likes of PCI and other compliance standards, have really been called to task or called into question by the National Institute of Technology and Standards, NIST, the National Cybersecurity Center, the NCSC in the UK, and also Microsoft. And the reasoning behind, calling these two things out specifically is that, they've really looked at research saying that complexity and expiry actually end up leading to this unsecure user password construction behavior. And of course, the bullet point here says, essentially all of them also do recommend to utilize multi-factor authentication versus just utilizing passwords standalone. But, being in the password management industry, what we hear from our customers and our prospects is the following. They are not replacing passwords with multi-factor authentication, because oftentimes a single form of MFA does not cover all use cases. So essentially, passwords are still very much at play. And if you think about it, with two-factor authentication, the password is the first factor, so it's still at play. And then if you look at MFA with hardware tokens, many organizations still have password as a backup in case that hardware token gets stolen or damaged or lost, as it means to allow the end user to gain access to their computer if they are working remotely, as an example. So again, MFA has failed to replace password across all use cases, and that's very much the reality of today. Our customers and prospects are also still looking at complexity, so they're not getting rid of it, and this is predominantly due to the fact that, it is familiar. It is something familiar to end users. I mean, when we go and we change our passwords across different sites, we've all been encountered with having to input a number or a capital letter, as an example, as part of our passwords. But it's also an easier approach to step up password security over implementing multi-factor authentication, both from a user and cost perspective. So it's seen as a quick win when, faced with an audit, as an example. And then, of course, Xperi is also still being used. And this obviously has a lot to do with complexity regulation, and it still says you have to have, passwords expire every 90 days, as an example. But of course, most organizations out there, really, IT departments specifically, are not aware that they have been breached, and the average time that it takes to know that you've been breached is about 200 days. That's a long time. So of course, Xperi is still it's seen as a way to limit that exposure. And then lastly, we've been getting a lot of inquiries and a lot of requests around password blacklisting. And, obviously it kind of goes with the security breaches hand in hand, right? You have now online over 1 billion passwords available. These are from password dumps. And, you have the likes of NIST and the NCSC also proclaiming that you should be using password blacklists. So, of course, we see a lot of interest in password blacklisting capability. So, with that being said, I really want to underpin this point. You can make a password as complex as can be, but if it appears on a password leaked list, it is a pretty weak password. And if you look at some of the leaked lists out there, beyond the most common passwords like password1 or password123 or QWERTY, there are some pretty unique complex passwords on those lists. So and just because they're complex does not mean that they are strong in this kind of conversation. If they're on a leaked list, they're a weak password. But, with all of that being said, there are other vulnerabilities that organizations should also be on the lookout for. Things like, do I have any still admin accounts in my environment, or any accounts in my environment just kind of living with passwords that never have to expire, things like that, hackers really do take advantage of such low-hanging fruit. So from our standpoint, how can SpecOps help? So we have the SpecOps password policy, which includes the SpecOps password blacklist solution, and this allows organizations to utilize robust dictionary and complexity settings to really secure or create secure policies that can be varied across different user roles, again, because we are Active Directory group policy based. And SpecOps password policy and the SpecOps password blacklist can be used to create complex password roles that can enforce the use of all 4 character types if that's what you would need, and or to create longer passwords or passphrases. It also can be used to block the use of predictable patterns like using incremental characters at the end of the passwords, or preventing users from using keyboard patterns like QWERTY as an example, or using what is known as leet speak, substituting, as an example, the letter S with a $sign. The solution also allows organizations to leverage a continuously updated hosted password blacklist that includes 1 billion leaked passwords. This can also be used in conjunction with the dictionary's, the solution's customizable dictionary feature, and this will allow you to then also block users from using words or acronyms that are associated with your organization. And lastly, the solution also supports many other out-of-the-box dictionaries. And as it relates to uncovering other vulnerabilities in your environment, we do offer a free downloadable solution called the SpecOps Password Auditor. And this can be used to scan Active Directory regularly for vulnerabilities to identify things like stale admin accounts, accounts with expired passwords, or account with weak or non-compliant passwords. And this is just, a means to ensure that you have a good handle on the security status of your environment. So that's it from me.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Liz. And thank you again, Nick. You've got some great guidelines and great thoughts about how to set up a better password policy. All right. Well, I just want, before we get into the Q&A section, I just want to quickly remind everyone that there is still time to ask a question if you'd like. Just type a question to the left of the slide window, and we'll get to as many as we can in the next few moments here. All right. To start off, actually more of a comment than a question here. Someone from obviously a public school system agrees that user passwords in the education space are a huge issue. We couldn't agree more. The first question is, and this, I think I know what the answer is going to be, and we'll start off with you, Nick. Do passwords really need to be changed every 2 to 6 months? I mean, is there any leeway there?
I'm going to say that's a corporate decision. It really is. It comes down to it's just a matter of risk. I mean, in concept, let's put it this way. So in concept, if you never share your password, and you're extremely vigilant, making sure that you don't click anything you shouldn't, and you don't have anything infected on your machine, and no phishing attack has ever compromised your machine and put a keylogger in, and so on and so forth. In theory, you could keep that password forever, right? I mean, you could. Mm-hmm. No one knows it but you. In fact, when I got vished this week, it was through my PayPal account, my personal PayPal account, and I've had the exact same password since whatever it is, 1995 or whenever PayPal first came out, 20 years or 15 years. It's been the same. I never changed it. No one ever used it. In fact, the guys that vished me didn't get it either. They were just resetting the password. So I'm like, crap. I was sort of proud that I had a password that was never used anywhere else, but it was good for 15 years. And I think the reality of the question, so whoever's asking that in the audience there, you simply have to weigh out the whole. It's exactly what you already know. I'm just going to tell you stuff you already know because it's really this obvious. Is
classic reminder.
You know your users are going, oh, why do I have to change my password? This is horrible. Again, mixed with the organization's view on risk. And the idea there is you take one of the stats that Liz talked about it being, 200 days or something, I think you said, Liz, about how long it takes to know that there's a breach. Microsoft even posted some stuff. I don't know if that stat comes from Microsoft, but they've got one from one of their internal kind of threat response kind of products that's new coming out. I forget which one it was, but they had something very similar to that. And it's always months. It's months and months to find data breaches, to find fraud, that kind of thing. So that's where the idea of, you should change your password comes into play. So that way, in case someone did get access to a password, and the way they do that typically is an attacker will come in, they get access to a machine, they try and get elevated rights on that machine. There's a couple ways to do that, but I'll skip that for the purpose here. And what they do is they use automated tools. You can go download a tool called Mimikatz, Mimikatz. Go look that up. And Mimikatz will scrape RAM, and it'll find clear text passwords. It'll find password hashes, which can be used to pass the hash attacks. It has Kerberos tickets you can download, and then you can try and use rainbow tables and try to break them and things like that. There's lots of ways to utilize that data, but it's all there in memory. And so the idea is not so much that maybe in a circumstance where they have a keylogger, they're going to see you type your new password. So what good did that do? But in cases where they got it out of memory, the idea of changing your password is still viable because then that password they got out of memory is no longer valid.
Yeah. And what you said, Liz, about it takes average 200 days to discover a breach. A lot of damage can be done in that time. That's for sure.
Yeah, and there's been a lot of research behind it. As you said, Nick, Microsoft put some stats out. My stat actually came from Ponemon Institute.
Oh, the Ponemon Institute, yeah, sure. Yep, they do some wonderful research in the security world. So. All right. This next question is probably more for you, Liz. Audience member asked that they have Azure Active Directory. How would that work with the blacklist in SpecOps?
So, like I said, we are Active Directory integrated. So if you are leveraging Azure and you're syncing that with Active Directory, by default, then the blacklist would then block the use of any leaked password, and then that obviously would also be reflected in Azure if you're syncing the two.
Yep. Okay. And kind of a related question here. If they once they enable blacklist, will the user's passwords become unavailable after that?
Not immediately.
Okay.
Once you enable blacklist, what happens is that once a user goes in to change their password based off of the expiry, as an example, they will actually be notified if they're trying to change their password to a password that appears on the leak list. They will be notified straight away that they cannot use that password.
Right. Okay. All right. Yeah, here's a question about a couple of other tools. Do you see password management software such as like LastPass or 1Password as a security risk since all the credentials are secured by one password? I think that might be for you, Liz.
Do I see them as I think that Nick had mentioned something similar to this, right, when he was talking about single sign-on? I mean, so basically, having the keys to the kingdom all in one place. So I would have to agree with that statement as it relates to this question.
Yeah, okay. Obviously the onus gets put on the vendor that's hosting. Right. If it's a PAM solution, let's say, that's got a password vault and a bunch of policies around it, who can access what and when and all those kinds of things, the onus is on them now. Now, it's got to be ultra secure. If it's LastPass or whatever else it is, you need that as well. So, yes, certainly it comes into question, how secure is this? And I guess I'm going to come down paths in my head right now. One of the things that becomes a real challenge is when external attackers get into your network. If they can do things like, even if you have a virtual environment, they'll actually go after things like trying to get added to groups that manage, let's say, your Hyper-V environment. Because if they do that, then in essence they have physical access. I'm doing physical, it's virtual, but it's physical access to those virtual machines, if you will, because now they can get into any one of them, and then they have access. Let me back up that data, and let me go restore it somewhere else, and then start hacking against it. So I'm giving you a real kind of an outlier example of something that could be done, but in general, utilizing some kind of solution, as long as it's a reputable company, and you're doing diligence on, well, what is the security? And if they go, we use 445-bit AES Blowfish encryption on the database, and okay, no one's ever going to get it anyways. It just sort of depends. But I would definitely put some pressure on the idea of making sure that the vendor truly has that database really, 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 really secure.
Okay. All right. Here's another question I think that relates more to back to blacklist, Liz. If an organization were to block all those 1 million passwords on that list, would that cause any usability issues?
So it's actually 1 billion, and it is a lot of passwords. But like I said before, these are the result of different password dumps. So we've looked at different lists out there, aggregated them. And if you really look at these lists, a lot of the passwords go beyond, just the common ones that we see, like password 1, password 1, 2, 3. So not all of them are going to be something, that like a user is just going to utilize, unless you're super techie or you're just unlucky that way. But also I think, in the event that, yes, let's say it does create some sort of user issue, I think you really need to look at solutions that, provide feedback in real time to the user, letting them know, or at least you can enable this if you wanted to, let them know, okay, you failed against this word, so it's not going to continue to be like a guessing game for them.
Yep. Okay. Anything you want to add to that, Nick? Or?
No, I just like the guessing game because that would be frustrating for users. It's like I've had that. Why? Why isn't it secure? You're literally
Exactly.
So I'm with 100%. Make it user friendly. That'd be awesome. People at least like the feedback of why they can't get their password. Good stuff.
And the more user friendly it is, the more likely they're actually to adhere the rules. All right, got a kind of a higher level question here that we'll close out with. I'll start with you, Nick. Do you think passwords will ever be replaced?
Yes, I do. I think at some point the password is a technology that's been around for as long as any of us can remember in IT, and then some. Right? It's been around for many, many years because it's an easy way. Passphrases were used, even back in World War II, and all that kind of stuff. Right? Just a simple way of knowing that you're authenticating who you are. And but obviously we've got biometrics today. The idea of multi-factor authentication, and there's some other technologies that I've sort of read about, but they're such on the outliers and fringes that I don't even want to go into them yet. But where they're trying to leverage ways of coming up with very unique identifiers for an individual of something that can't be hacked is the idea. I don't know that anything's unhackable because we just saw the thing with what's his name, John McAfee, and his little his wallet dongle, whatever thing that was, and it got hacked immediately. That kind of thing. So but I do believe at some point the idea of a password may become so old school that that doing it is like, you actually type that in? What? And then that actually becomes more secure, because no one ever does that anymore, kind of a thing. Sure, but I think we're going to go the path where we have other ways of proving that you are who you say you are. And we're seeing it today, especially with biometrics, as just one example.
Yep. Okay. Liz, do you have anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I agree. I don't think that, passwords are going to live forever. I think the key question is, when will they actually go away? I think that the slogan, death of the password has been tossed around for a very long time. And they haven't died yet. So I think they'll be around for many more years to come.
So we have to work with them as best we can for
until they're replaced with something that's super easy and, like you said, Nick, super safe. But we're not there yet.
That is for sure. All right. That was about all the questions we had for today. I'd like to kind of wrap up here and ask if you have any final thoughts, any concluding statements. We'll start with you, Nick. One last thing you want to tell our listeners?
Final thoughts. One, I commend you for being on this webcast because at least you're thinking about security. I mean that in all sincerity because I'm doing a tremendous amount of writing and speaking around every aspect of security, particularly around what the threats are and what the bad guys are doing. And every effort you can make to add another layer of security to your security strategy that addresses it from a different perspective, a different angle, creating kind of a defense in depth methodology is good. So the fact that you're thinking about, I think I want to have another layer that's just let me put up a secure set of passwords in. Let me make sure that they're very complex and easily guessed. All that kind of stuff. That's adding to this. We joke about admin and admin. Like admin's the ID and admin's the password kind of a thing. But like there's a Facebook group that I belong to. If you guys go back to, you remember the 2600, the Hacker Quarterly magazine used to be out, and I'm on there with a bunch of these hacker guys, and they're far more hackery than I am. I'm not very hackery, but I love hanging out with these guys and listening to them. And they share stories over and over and over again about just like default password stuff that's just left wide open and how someone gained access to something because. It doesn't happen every day, but it does happen. And so going back, I commend you guys for thinking about this. Do something about it. Definitely think about this as being one of the layers in your multi-layer defense strategy. And I hope you learned something today. I hope it was helpful.
Yeah. All right. Great way to frame it. All right, Liz, any concluding thoughts from you?
No, I think I second, Nick, your thoughts here. It is great to have a discussion on security, especially around passwords. I mean, it remains the number one authentication method, right?
Absolutely.
And I think we all can agree that more training is needed, especially like from the user perspective, because like I said before, I mean, users don't always think about IT security, and this is one of the first kind of doors into the kingdom. So I think, having conversations always is helpful. So thank you guys for having me.
Absolutely, yeah. Active awareness is more than half the battle, I would say. All right. Well, thank you again to both Nick Cavalancio and Liz Rivera for your presentations today. And thanks to the audience for attending this webcast. And thanks also to SpecOps Software for your sponsorship. Thanks again, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day. This concludes today's webcast.